Hi, everyone, and welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome to another exciting AdvisorShares AlphaNooner. Today, we're excited to dive into one of the most interesting stories in the emerging medicine space, talking NRx Pharma with the chairman and CEO, Dr. Javitt. We're going to spend some time talking through biotech, developing novel treatments for depression, PTSD, and suicidality. A lot to uncover and unpack today, so very excited to have this guest on to kind of provide some more education, insight in terms of where they are and where we are in the broader conversation when it comes to developing new medicines for these different treatments. So one, if you're out there, really appreciate you joining as always. Two, if you have any questions or comments you want to add into the conversation, want to invite you to take the time to put a comment in if you have it, and we can try to get to it as we go along. With all that said, Dr. Javitt, really appreciate you joining. Thanks so much. How was your week starting off?
Well, it's a great week. And
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
You still have me?
I still have you, yeah. Sorry.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's really shaping up to be a great week. There's a lot converging all at once. As you know, Secretary Collins of the Veterans Administration has made it very clear that suicide prevention in veterans is priority number one for him. I think we're seeing the Department of Defense focus in the same way. And as we've started to acquire our network of clinics within Hope Therapeutics, they're actively contracting as part of the VA Community Cares Program and direct contracting with the VA to be able to provide neuroplastic treatments. That's both neuroplastic drugs such as ketamine and S-ketamine Spravato, together with transcranial magnetic stimulation and soon hyperbaric oxygen therapy, both to active duty, retired military, and veterans with suicidal depression and PTSD.
Yeah, a lot of these treatments I think desperately needed, and I think sit very squarely in the kind of current moment of conversation in terms of how to address these issues, especially when it comes to kind of the lens of veterans. So I know a lot to talk about. Again, you have been very busy from a company perspective in terms of what you've been doing and a lot of updates to share. So I know we will work through those. But first, just again, I think people are new and joining and kind of learning about sort of neuroplastic medicines, what they can be. So just wanted to start with kind of a quick table set on NRx, just for people who are joining in new.
So, all of this began in the 1980s when Dan Javitt discovered the role of the NMDA receptor in the brain, initially around schizophrenia, but by 2000, it was clear that drugs that block the NMDA receptor, ketamine being one of the first such drugs, can have a potent antidepressant effect. And about 9 years later, Carlos Zarate at the National Institutes of Health proved that effect was also a potent anti-suicidality effect. There are now multiple clinical trials demonstrating that that ketamine as an intravenous drug, which is the racemic form of ketamine, has a rapid antidepressant, anti-suicidal effect, proven both against placebo, against active comparator, specifically midazolam, and ketamine has also been proven to be non-inferior, but actually statistically superior to electroshock therapy in treating patients with severe depression. The J&J drug Spravato is becoming increasingly used. It's administered nasally. It's the S form of ketamine. It's demonstrated an antidepressant effect, but not necessarily an anti-suicidal effect. But clearly, this new generation of drugs is changing the whole way we look at these diseases. Probably what's changed the most in the last few years is our understanding, and this began with really a landmark paper published by Dr. Connor Liston in Science, which is one of the leading journals in the field, showing that ketamine causes what's called neuroplasticity, which is a long multisyllabic word for new connections to form in the brain. That in mouse models of depression, you see that the little dendrites that connect one brain cell to the next are atrophied. And you can also have the formation of what they call giant dendrites, which are large connections between brain cells that don't get pruned in the normal neuroplasticity process. And that's thought to be analogous to human depression. In that model, if you treat with ketamine, you show not only sprouting of those dendrites, but pruning of large dendrites, restoration of neuroplasticity. And we think that that's analogous to the profound clinical improvement that we see when patients are treated with ketamine. Now, the problem with ketamine is that although its effects are potentially miraculous compared to those of electroshock, ketamine is a dangerous drug. It's addictive, it's neurotoxic, it's hallucinogenic, can't be given by mouth. So as a short-term drug for achieving remission, it's pretty exciting to us. As a drug that's going to be given long-term, it's a little more concerning. That's why we've been working with a product that we call NRx 101, which is based on D-cycloserine. And if you think of the NMDA receptor as a pipe between the outside of the brain cell and the inside of the cell that lets calcium ions flow through, ketamine's like sticking a cork in that pipe. D-cycloserine is a lot more like turning a faucet.
Interesting way to.
Cycloserine it's not addictive, it's not hallucinogenic. Well, it can be hallucinogenic in large doses, but that's mitigated by adding a drug like lorazepam, which we've done in NRx 101, but it's not addictive. And more importantly, and we've published this, although the neurotoxicity of ketamine is very well established, if you give 90 doses of ketamine to a primate, you turn that brain to Swiss cheese.
So there's an important balance, it sounds like, in terms of how
it's an important balance. But we've taken D-cycloserine all the way to its lethal dose, which is an extraordinarily high dose. You've got to give like 2.5 milligrams per kilogram to kill a rodent with D-cycloserine. Even at that lethal dose, there's no neurotoxicity. And we've published that. And if you look in FDA guidance, FDA is really very concerned about neurotoxicity with any NMDA active molecule, because it's been shown since the 1990s that all of these molecules have the potential to cause what they call, glutamate-induced neurotoxicity in the brain. So we think of NRx 101 as potentially a safer long-term drug once you've established remission with ketamine, but more importantly, transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is increasingly coming into its own, is a treatment where you take the same type of magnet that's used in an MRI machine, use it to target areas within the brain, and you can induce neuroplasticity. You can induce these same beneficial changes that are otherwise induced with NMDA antagonist drugs. So our perspective is that maybe you'll get a 70% response with these neuroplastic drugs. Maybe you'll get a similar response with TMS. If you combine those treatments, then all of a sudden you have potential to achieve very high levels of response. And some of this has been published by an investigator in British Columbia named McGeer, who combined D-cycloserine with transcranial magnetic stimulation, saw response rates above 80%. And recently you've seen Josh Brown, who's the new chairman of psychiatry at Harvard McLean Hospital, talk about replicating those findings, and other people who are on the forefront of TMS talk about replicating those findings, not with the dose of D-cycloserine that's found in NRx 101, which is a fairly high dose, but with a much lower dose of D-cycloserine, which we've been asked to provide under compassionate care protocols, and will likely provide under compounded pharmacy as well, because it appears that D-cycloserine plus TMS, at least from the perspective of the experts in the field, and I'm not one, I'm an eye surgeon, but from the perspective of the experts in the field, it's like fertilizing a field before you plant the seeds.
That makes sense. Very interesting. I think, a lot more research being done. I think it's understandable that there is a very urgent need for a lot of these ailments, suicidality, obviously PTSD, depression, all these things as well. So I think there has been more willingness and more research that's been done, to pull out how it works, to really refine and find the right balance that is really important to deliver the right results ultimately. And I think focusing in kind of on the ketamine element is really important too, just in terms of the type of neuroplastic drug versus kind of others that are out there. Because there has been, I think, a general kind of renaissance in terms of looking at more previously uninvestigated, I think, ways to address some of these issues lately. Speaking kind of to that.
Even with the psychedelic drugs,
Yeah.
people are very excited about psilocybin. They're excited about some of these old psychedelic molecules.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, you've got a whole new generation of drugs based on the same molecules that have the neuroplastic effect, but not the hallucinogenic effect.
Mm-hmm.
And if those, there have been phase 2 trials showing profound remission of depression with no hallucinogenicity. So the old notion that the psychedelic trip has something to do with patients' brains getting better may turn out to be something we don't talk about 2 years from now.
That is very interesting. Yeah, I do think it's basically being able to take what you can find in nature and really change and adapt it, where you are just taking the best parts of it. So if you are just trying to extract basically the neuroplastic elements of the compounds and being able to use that without, some people I think that the hallucinogenic element is a positive. Some don't need it and might kind of deter them from using medicine if it does require that. So I think being able to create tools that allow for the key good effects, isolating those key good effects while kind of allowing people to tailor to their experience what they want, makes a difference and widens, I think, the scale of people who can use these types of drugs. So very encouraged on that front. Would want to talk a little bit. I feel like this year, I think we've been building on kind of some momentum for more interest in these types of drugs, more interest in these types of treatments. But I know we've also gotten more interest kind of from the new administration in terms of trying to embrace some of these treatments, more wholeheartedly, I think. I think part of that had been through the FDA fast tracking system that they have kind of trying to open up for new and novel treatments. Would love to kind of hear how that intersects, briefly at least with NRx, because I know there's been some movement there, which has been great.
Yeah, and certainly, we were excited that FDA gave us a much broader fast track designation for NRx 100. That's our preservative-free ketamine product. Originally, when we started with FDA in 2017, they gave us fast track designation for a protocol that involved the use of NRx 100, followed by NRx 101 in bipolar depression. And now they've expanded that fast track designation for NRx 100 in the treatment of suicidal ideation in depression and all forms of depression, including bipolar depression.
That has to be big.
It's a large indication. Certainly, FDA is going to ask us for a lot of data. And the data that we're bringing to bear involves several clinical trials, one from the French government at 7 hospitals where patients with suicidal depression were randomized to ketamine versus placebo and showed a profound effect. A second financed by the National Institutes of Health, where patients with depression and suicidality were randomized to midazolam. If you recall the problems with the MDMA application, people said, well, there's unblinding going on in the trial because people know whether or not they got a psychoactive drug.
Sure.
So they were inclined, people who got placebo were inclined to be disappointed and say they got no effect. People who got the drug are inclined to be happy about that and say they got an effect. So midazolam also gives you an altered state of mind. And yet ketamine had a profound effect on depression and suicidality, whereas midazolam did not. And when they switched it, took the people who were originally given midazolam and gave them ketamine, they got the same effect on suicidality and depression as the people who got ketamine in the first place. And then you have the 400-person PCORI trial showing that people who were randomized to ketamine got at least as good a response on depression scales as people randomized to electroconvulsive therapy, commonly called electroshock therapy. But more importantly, the people who got ketamine had no serious adverse effects, whereas the people who got electroshock therapy, 30% of them or more had loss of short-term memory. So they may be similar in their antidepressant effect, but very different in their side effect profile. And
Yeah.
of course, electroconvulsive therapy requires anesthesia and muscle paralysis, whereas intravenous ketamine is, a 2-hour session in a doctor's office.
Yeah, that is true. I do think also with electroshock therapy, I think there are still some hangovers of sort of fears around doing something like that, even though I know it's possible to do. But ultimately, you want to follow where the best effects are. And if that's with ketamine, I think that's great to be, again,
Well,
developing that.
it's certainly possible to do electroshock, and it's very different from the old scene in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yes.
Not because we don't induce a seizure in the brain, which we do, but because first we anesthetize you and paralyze you so it doesn't make your arms and legs shake and your teeth break.
Yes.
But you're still inducing a seizure in the brain, and you're still causing memory loss.
Yes, that is true. I guess are those between sort of the electroshock and ketamine in terms of overcoming some of the stigmas, overcoming some of the maybe rougher attempts at it from the past? Do you think we're getting there? Does the research help? Does sort of the education help? What sort of helps?
Well, remember, I come at this as an eye surgeon, a glaucoma specialist, and to me, this is a bit crazy.
Mm-hmm.
If you have loss of neuroplasticity in your basal ganglia and it causes a tremor, and we call that Parkinson's disease, then if we have a treatment, and TMS may be one of those treatments, that restores neuroplasticity in the basal ganglia, makes brain cells reconnect to each other properly, and makes those tremors go away, people are excited to get the treatment, and they don't think of it as a stigma. And yet, if you have loss of neuroplasticity in your frontal cortex, and as a result, you have depression and you have suicidal ideation, all of a sudden we treat that differently. We don't look at it sort of dispassionately as a neurological problem to be solved. We treat that differently. We treat you differently. We put a stigma around it, and that's a stigma that, from my perspective, causes people not to get the care that they need. Now, the problem is, until a couple of years ago, we really had very little to do for those patients. The early generations of antidepressant drugs worked imperfectly at best. Traditional psychotherapy worked imperfectly at best. That doesn't mean that it's not critical to have a therapist involved with a patient to guide that patient into effective patterns of care.
Mm-hmm.
But because we had so little ability to help patients, perhaps we told a story about psychiatric diseases that actually kept people from getting life-saving care. Now, as those means of care become available, that whole world has to change. I mean, I didn't do very well in psychiatry in medical school because I kept wanting to cure people, and they kept saying, "You don't understand. You've got rescue fantasies, and we don't cure people here in psychiatry." Well, that world is changing.
That is that's a huge impact. That does feel like the leap from sort of old school pharma into these new novel drugs that do seem to have pretty long lasting effects. You said miraculous earlier, but I do think people who are approaching it for the first time might be surprised in terms of some of the results that you've been able to see. Again, requires more testing, more research, all of that. But
yeah, I should be careful about the word miraculous, especially at this time of year, and especially the FDA might not really appreciate that word. But if you do look at the findings where the people who've gotten these treatments have profound and immediate effects compared to people who've gotten placebo or active comparators, I'd certainly say that the magnitude of those effects is unprecedented.
I think that is fair. I was not trying to overstate it as well, but I do think for people who are approaching it maybe for the first time might be encouraged, I think, by some of the results. Again, it requires more. I totally understand that. And I do want to make sure we're not overstating it. But yeah, I think it is hopefully a new step up for the world of treatments of drugs like these. So fingers crossed, I think, on that side. And yeah, I think that's important ultimately. Okay, so that sounds good in terms of where things are moving through for the FDA. I know those are in process. And I know, I think for ketamine, I had seen a stat, I think maybe you had put out in terms of the market for ketamine being almost $1 billion in the US and much larger abroad. So it seems like once those move through on the track, there's a lot of potential for growth for
Well, there are two markets for ketamine. There's the existing market for generic ketamine, and that's a $750 million market right now.
Sure.
And it's growing. And then there's the potential market if ketamine is approved as a drug to treat depression and suicidality, where Johnson & Johnson has reported $1.3 billion of sales just with their Spravato nasal spray.
Oh, wow. Okay.
For this new indication. And that market is, we're just at the very beginning of it. The vast majority of patients who have severe depression and suicidality are still not being referred for these neuroplastic treatments. So that market could
Be even larger.
Easily grow by, multiple folds.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. Sorry to understate that, I guess, on that front. Okay. Well, then maybe kind of talking through some other things that I know have been highlights for you and what you've been working through. I know we've talked about Hope Therapeutics as it ties into NRx and some acquisitions lately in terms of clinics. Can you kind of tell us high level, what the story has been in terms of that side of things?
Sure. I mean, from a high level perspective, what we saw as we embarked on our drug development program is that often the people who are interested in these neuroplastic drugs are not doing transcranial magnetic stimulation. Often the people doing TMS are not very effective in their use of neuroplastic drugs. And there's a real dearth of people out there who are integrating these treatments. And as hyperbaric oxygen comes along, that's also a whole different world of people from the people who are doing TMS and neuroplastic drugs. So, our desire was to put all of these under one roof because we don't think that there's any one modality that's going to be sufficient for this disease. That's a lethal disease. We lose an American to suicide every 11 minutes. And because there seemed to be a real vacuum there, we said, let's put together best-in-class clinics that are A, going to lead the way, and B, may offer a system of care that changes the world in the same way that when DeVita and Fresenius first began, renal dialysis was a pretty risky business, and it was hard to know whether a dialysis clinic was going to save you or kill you. And they put in reliable, reproducible, trustworthy care. Cancer Centers of America took the best protocols out of academic medical centers and made it possible for you to get state-of-the-art cancer care in a suburb of Cincinnati without having to travel to the Cleveland Clinic or to MD Anderson or Sloan Kettering. And we think that whole science of neuroplastic therapy for the worst diseases in CNS is in its infancy. And we're not only talking about depression and PTSD, that may be where we're developing drugs, but there's increasing evidence that TMS and hyperbaric have a role in the treatment of Parkinson's, in the treatment of cognitive dysfunction, in the treatment of autism, that these are discrete areas within the brain where you have loss of functional connectivity, and it may be possible to stimulate neuroplastic growth and connectivity with treatments such as TMS, if that treatment can be properly aimed, can be properly localized within the brain.
Interesting. So very much at the very beginning, but also at the forefront in terms of what these can do in the future, and a lot to kind of go forward into the future. In terms of the clinics now and the treatment now, is there any specific kind of group that's being targeted? I feel like a lot of the conversation around suicidality, PTSD has squarely been kind of on the veteran side of things. I know, from the administration, and also I think most Americans obviously want to support veterans in whatever way they can. Has that been a focus?
We know that we're losing 22 veterans in active duty every day to suicide. I was one of the keynote speakers at Fort Belvoir at the U.S. Army Museum just 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I spoke opposite a senior advisor to Secretary Collins, who was unambiguous in saying that the secretary told him his first day on the job that veteran suicide is priority number one. If you look at the 100-day cabinet meeting that President Trump did on television with his cabinet, the first question he asked Secretary Collins is, what's the VA doing about veteran suicide? And the clinics that we've already acquired, and we've started with Dura Medical in in southwest Florida, in Naples, Fort Myers, up through Sarasota. They're already part of the VA Community Cares Network. We've had a cooperative research and development agreement with the VA since 2017. The VA is very clear that this is a top priority for them, that losing veterans to suicide is just unacceptable. And it's not only veterans, it's first responders of all forms. I'm an officer in the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary. Some of you have seen me in my flight suit, and I have the privilege of flying search and rescue missions from time to time as an aviator. But the Coast Guard stood down the entire force of 44,000 active duty and 22,000 auxiliarists last year for training on suicide prevention and stress resilience, because we lost 14 Guardians to suicide in a year where we lost nobody to operations, even though we have a habit of dangling people from helicopters over Arctic waters.
Sure.
So this is a condition that affects all first responders, whether they're firefighters, law enforcement, and of course, affects people who are not first responders. The vast majority of PTSD actually is not found in military and first responders, just because so much more of the population is not in those categories. So automobile accidents, other forms of trauma, domestic violence, all cause PTSD. All cause a 4 to 10-fold increased risk of suicide. And all of that seems to come back to common pathways in terms of loss of neuroplasticity and the potential for these treatments to change that. The most exciting information that's come out so far may be from Israel, where they've done a randomized controlled trial with hyperbaric oxygen therapy in soldiers suffering from PTSD, and shown a dramatic effect of hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which is known to increase neuroplasticity, maybe reawaken stem cells within the brain, compared to sham therapy. In other words, you put somebody in the same chamber, but don't take them up to 2 atmospheres of oxygen, don't do the pulse therapy. But they don't know that. They just know they're in the chamber.
Interesting. It seems like, a lot to be done across the board. Again, I think great to have the veterans element. And I think, again, for somebody who is kind of at least in that world and able to talk with people and really feel that impact personally, I think that's got to be a great motivator to try to move things forward and really try to find help for people like that. I think great to see that participation and try to have that level of communication between the VA and relationship between the VA and you to be able to, I'm sure, provide education. It is a new thing for them to kind of understand and absorb. Have there been any kind of questions that have been commonly coming up in terms of when you're kind of back and forth with them? Anything that you've had to dispel kind of?
Well, it's not a matter of dispelling, but I think the biggest question that's coming up is, when should these therapies be used? So right now, the doctrine within the military, within the VA, probably within a lot of psychiatric practices, is if somebody hasn't responded to up to 4 antidepressants, and this is a medical insurance issue as well. The insurance companies want to require that you try several antidepressants and fail before you get to transcranial magnetic stimulation and neuroplastic drugs. Well, the problem is every one of those antidepressants has a black box suicide warning on the label.
Yeah.
Caution, this drug may cause suicide. None of these drugs is indicated to treat suicidal depression. And there have been, class action lawsuits saying that people were harmed by being given these drugs when they were already known to have suicidal ideation. Yeah. So probably the next frontier is to change that paradigm and say, as soon as you're outside the labeling of these drugs, if you have bipolar depression where these drugs aren't indicated, if you have suicidal ideation, then maybe try one of these drugs. But saying you have to be treated with 3 or 4 different drugs and have them fail before you can get to therapy that seems to be working is probably not the best thing to do for people.
That is true. I also will say, I think with most antidepressants that are sort of pharmaceutical more traditional pharmaceutical antidepressants, I think they take a long time to take effect. So also that's probably a lot of time if you're taking, months and months and months where things can go wrong versus kind of having an immediate intervention impact and effect with kind of something like.
I mean, you can certainly criticize the serotonin drugs for not working quickly enough. When ketamine first came along, people called it the first rapid acting antidepressant, and it is true that it works very quickly. But the other side of these drugs is they cause a side effect called akathisia, which patients say they feel like they're jumping out of their skins. And akathisia is a very high risk for suicide. In fact, there's a woman who applied to the Supreme Court of Canada saying she wanted medical assistance in dying because she couldn't stand the akathisia being caused by her antidepressants. That's public record, so I can talk about it. We showed with NRx 101 that it's the first drug that's ever been shown to decrease akathisia, decrease suicide. When I say the first drug, the first oral drug that's ever been shown to decrease suicidality in that way. So the idea of trying 4 different antidepressants is, first of all, as you said, they take a long time to work if they're going to work. But there are published trials showing that they really only seem to work about a third of the time. The other side is they may actually induce side effects that are lethal side effects.
Yes, that makes sense. Again, I'm hoping for better tools. I'm glad that you're doing the work to produce better tools for people to use, veterans, regular people aside as well. So I think that's fantastic. Out of curiosity, just in terms of, bringing it into more of an investment element, it is obviously, of course, you're a publicly listed company. And I think there has been a lot more attention from an investor perspective into these types of treatments, into kind of this element and section of biotech. In terms of the conversation around NRx and sort of the neuroplastic drugs from an investment perspective, has that changed very much in the past 2 years, a year? How has that sort of reflected and changed?
I think a couple of things have affected the last 10 years. COVID certainly stopped us and stopped a lot of people in their tracks because it shut our clinics. We were within a couple of weeks of stopping operations when we were asked to work on a COVID drug that ultimately resulted in us going public, even though the epidemic ended before the drug got approved. So COVID slowed people down, and the fact that all of the major pharmaceutical organizations left psychiatry slowed a lot of people down because the investors said, well, where are the exits going to be if Merck and Pfizer and AstraZeneca and Roche and all of their fellow travelers, J&J, are out of psychiatry, then how are these biotechs ever going to get to market? And you're seeing a big change. You're seeing the exit of Karuna. You're seeing what's happened with Intracellular. You're seeing big pharma starting to get back into this enormous area of CNS, and that's changing the waterfront dramatically.
That's fantastic. Anything in terms of just sort of the general environment? I know we're potentially seeing lower rates, and I know that can sometimes be beneficial to biotech in general. Anything else sort of in the macro that you think is, a headwind ultimately for you?
Well, I think there are 3 drivers. One is people are understanding this mechanism of neuroplasticity. When we started talking about anti-NMDA drugs in 2016, based in large part on my brother's patents, people's eyes crossed. It was a whole new thing, and now everybody's talking about it. As you pointed out, when interest rates go up, a lot of generalist investors who don't have a commitment to any given sector are much more attracted to chasing those interest rates through, if you can buy T-bills, then why take a risk on biotech? And as interest rates come down, then people start seeking alpha. And I know that's a popular word on your show. People start seeking alpha in the biotech sector again. And lastly, as you've had some very prominent exits, Biohaven, Karuna, Intracellular, all of a sudden, people are realizing that if you develop a drug that's showing promise or actually gets approved, there are big pharma companies that are willing to get back into psychiatry and into this just extraordinarily large sector. For many years, everybody wanted to do rare diseases and orphan diseases because of financial incentives at FDA. And as those incentives are becoming somewhat tenuous, and people are realizing that the era of these old serotonergic drugs may be behind us and we're embracing a whole new era, then I think you see a whole new world coming into focus.
Yep, I think that's fantastic. I think a lot of great things kind of setting up for the neuroplastic drugs and kind of that revolution. I think we have seen that building momentum, that building interest, that building awareness and understanding, but it does feel like it's starting to, really come to roost, I guess, ultimately in a positive way, which is great. And I think if you're looking at how stocks have traded, I think you can also definitely see that so far, in the year, which is great as well. All right, well then I think, looking ahead, I know we're through the last third quarter. For the rest of the year, where is sort of the focus? What should investors be kind of keeping an eye on for NRx?
Well, we're focused, as we've told investors. Nothing I'm going to say is
Of course.
different from that. As we've told investors, we're focused on getting a generic approval for what we call KETAFREE, which is preservative-free ketamine. Because this toxic preservative, benzethonium chloride, may never have belonged in ketamine in the first place. The idea was you could, put a needle in the bottle more than once and pull out doses for more than one patient. Nobody does that anymore. But yet the benzethonium chloride has stayed in the bottle, and we've submitted a citizen's petition to FDA showing that this is very toxic stuff. I learned about it back in the mid-90s as a glaucoma specialist, when somebody asked the question, why does everybody with glaucoma have dry eye syndrome? And we learned that the benzalkonium chloride in all of the eye drops at the time was poisoning the goblet cells on the front of the eye and the conjunctiva that make one of the critical components, the lipid component of tears. And when we went to preservative-free drops for people with glaucoma, that got better. Now, part of the problem was the artificial teardrops that were being sold in those days also had benzalkonium chloride, so it only made it worse. And now you see shelves of preservative-free tears in every pharmacy. So I learned about these preservatives a long time ago, and when I recognized that they were in the ketamine bottle, I said, why are they there? Everybody said, well, they're there because it's required for the ketamine to stay stable in solution. So I said, well, let's see about that. And we made the first preservative-free ketamine, put it up for stability, and lo and behold, we've got data to support more than 2 years of room temperature shelf life with a preservative-free ketamine. So we've submitted that to FDA. They said, well, wait a second, you've got, you put 7 milligrams per mil of sodium chloride in your proprietary product in NRx 100 because you want it to be isotonic. We said, yeah. They said, well, actually, old-fashioned Ketalar, the generic drug, has 6.4 milligrams per ml of sodium chloride. And the law says you've got to have the same for the generic drug as the reference product. So your KETAFREE needs to be at that level of salt. So all of a sudden, we have two products. We have the proprietary product that we're bringing forward, NRx 100, hoping to get drug approval around treatment of depression and suicidal ideation. And we have KETAFREE, which is an ANDA application for the first preservative-free generic ketamine, hoping to replace all the ketamine that's being used in hospitals and outpatient clinics today. So we resolved the sodium chloride issue with FDA sort of in what we think in record time. They were willing to meet with us within a day or two. We've got the application back on file at the salt level that's equal to that in Ketalar. And we're hoping that FDA will take our citizen petition seriously, where we've said, well, these preservatives should be taken out of all these old injectable products because it's contrary to the whole MAHA initiative. why have toxic preservatives in foods and drugs if we don't have a compelling scientific reason to have them? So we'll see how FDA responds to that.
Yeah, but I think ultimately it seems like you're saying very in line with the current administration's goals, aims, trying to reduce preservatives or reduce sort of, I guess, needless elements that might cause problems down the line. It makes sense. Why not modernize if people were doing that in the past because they had, outdated protocols or the best protocols that they had at the time? Why
Or
not?
because we hadn't discovered yet that these quaternary amines, that's the fancy way of saying drugs like preservatives like benzalkonium chloride, benzethonium chloride, the toxicity hadn't been discovered. It wasn't understood. At this point in time, these preservatives are not on the GRAS list. That's what FDA calls generally recognized as safe. In fact, FDA's concern about benzethonium chloride is so high that they don't even allow it to be used in hand cleansers or topical antiseptics. So the notion that it should continue to be allowed to be used in drugs that are injected intravenously seems a little crazy to me.
Yes. No, I think that totally makes sense. Okay. Well, then, so in terms of timeline and being able to kind of follow up and follow along with that, are there any sort of general estimates, or should people be following along on the website, on socials, to kind of get a sense of when things are updated there?
Well, I think people know that FDA is pretty good about sticking to its timelines in terms of agreeing to file or not file an ANDA application within 60 days of filing. So, that's a potential timeline. We've talked about our application for Commissioner's National Priority Voucher, and that's a new program that Commissioner Macri has established for drugs that address a public health crisis, and certainly suicide, both in military first responders and civilians, is a public health crisis. For drugs that address an unmet medical need, and FDA has said in writing that NRx 100 potentially addresses an unmet medical need in patients with suicidality and depression. Drugs that bring manufacturing back to the United States. Most ketamine is made overseas and at varying qualities. I've had my veterinarian complain to me that she sees very different results in anesthetizing dogs so they can get their teeth cleaned, depending on who made the ketamine. So there's clear differences in quality, at least from the veterinarian's perspective, from these various foreign manufactured forms of ketamine. So we're bringing the ketamine manufacture back to the United States in a preservative-free way, with novel packaging, and also focusing on anti-diversion packaging to keep this stuff in doctors' offices and out of nightclubs.
Yeah.
So all of those are priorities under the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher Program, as well as drugs that potentially reduce healthcare costs to patients. And we know that a patient who's being treated with electroconvulsive therapy on average costs about $40,000 per year, whereas these are treatments that are far less expensive, and from what we're seeing, compared to the memory loss and other complications associated with ECT, potentially far less toxic. So we think this drug potentially meets all of the written criteria that FDA set out for the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher Program, and we're hoping that Congress will get the federal government open as quickly as possible so that we can proceed with the application.
That is fair. Yeah, we didn't even talk about how the shutdown impacts everything, but I'm guessing that just is on pause temporarily until things move along. But that seems great.
In general, the people at FDA who need to move these things forward are affected by the shutdown, just like everybody else in the federal government.
Yeah, that's true. Hopefully that resolves soon. But either way, it seems like, again, working on a lot of great things that are well aligned, and I think hopefully show a lot of promise, and excited to see how things move along, for the year and beyond. I think ultimately, in terms of people who are either investors or just interested and want to learn more, would you basically point them to the website and social? Where would be the place?
To the website, and we put out an announcement this morning saying I'm going to be talking about some of these issues with some slides and maybe a little more quantitative stuff at an investor conference this week, sponsored by Noble Securities, and that'll be available to people afterwards. So we're trying to get the data out to people as it emerges, and we're always happy to hear from investors who want to meet with us. I'm happy to meet with any investor on information that's already out there, so that we're not talking about material public information. But my door is always open to an investor, and come see us at the conferences we attend. That's probably the best way to come see us.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I'll definitely try to retweet. I think there's a link for people to sign up to be able to watch along with this week's program. So I will check that out as well. But yeah, I think that's fantastic to be accessible, to be reachable. I think there's a lot of education still to be done, but we are making a ton of progress, which is fantastic. So thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. Of course, would point you to check out more of those resources if you want more information. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, Dr. Javitt, for being on, spending the time, providing that education and those updates. It's an interesting moment in time, and it feels like very squarely aligned with sort of the neuroplasticity element. So really, really appreciate it as well.
Thank you, Mackenzie. It's always good to see you.
Great to see you as well. All right. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks.
Before investing, carefully consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses found in the prospectus, available at AdvisorShares.com.